The oppressive weight of the lace veil was nothing compared to the crushing gravity of 1,000 pairs of eyes. Nadia stood at the altar, a monument in white satin, feeling more like a sacrifice than a bride. The pipe organ's triumphant melody had faded into a horrifying, expectant silence. Julian, the man who was supposed to be her future, stood before her, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pity and disgust. He hadn't even bothered to lower his voice. The microphone clipped to his lapel amplified his every cruel syllable, turning his private betrayal into a public execution. "I can't do this," he announced, his voice echoing through the cavernous church. "Look at you. I thought I could overlook certain things for the sake of my career. My father was right. The Vances need an heir from a thoroughbred. Not this," he gestured vaguely at her, at the full curve of her hips and the soft swell of her arms, his hand waving away her entire existence as if she were an unfortunate stain on the marble floor. A collective gasp rippled through the pews, quickly followed by a cascade of hushed, venomous whispers. Nadia could feel them like physical blows. Isabel Vance, Julian's childhood friend and the woman who embodied everything Nadia was not, thin, blonde, and born into astronomical wealth, smiled from the front row. It was a small, triumphant little smirk that said, "I won." Nadia's world narrowed to that smile, to the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears, and to the cold, dead weight of the bouquet in her hands. Her mother was sobbing somewhere behind her. Her father's silence was somehow worse. She was a pariah, a joke, a 20-year-old woman left at the altar not for a change of heart, but for the crime of her own body. Humiliation was a physical entity, a hot, suffocating cloak that threatened to choke the very air from her lungs. She wanted to run, to scream, to vanish, but her feet were leaden, rooted to the spot of her own immolation. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until it was shattered by a new sound. A single, sharp clap of expensive leather shoes on stone. A man was walking down the aisle, not rushing, but moving with a deliberate, predatory grace that commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. The whispers died instantly, replaced by a new, more fearful tension. He was a specter of impossible elegance and menace, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his lean, powerful frame like a second skin. His face was a masterpiece of sharp angles and cold control, his dark eyes missing nothing. Tattoos, intricate and serpentine, peeked from the collar of his crisp white shirt and the cuffs of his sleeves. Nadia recognized him, though she had no idea why he was here. Ryuichi Tanaka. A name spoken only in hushed tones in the city's underbelly, a phantom who controlled ports, politics, and everything in between. He was the head of the Koryamagumi, a man who built empires on fear and loyalty. He stopped directly in front of the altar, his gaze bypassing the now trembling Julian and landing squarely on Nadia. The air crackled. He didn't speak to the priest or the groom. He spoke only to her, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "He is a fool," Ryuichi stated, not as an opinion, but as an incontrovertible fact. "His bloodline is weak and his honor is non-existent." "You are throwing away a diamond for a piece of glass," Julian paled, sputtering. "Oh, who do you think you are? This is a private matter." Ryuichi didn't even glance at him. He simply raised a single, elegant hand, and two of his men, previously invisible among the guests, materialized and flanked Julian, their presence a silent, deadly promise. Julian fell silent, his face ashen with a terror that Nadia had never seen before. Ryuichi's dark eyes returned to her, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold command in them. It was a flicker of appreciation, an assessment. This church was paid for. The flowers are arranged. "The bride is here," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It would be a shame to waste the occasion. Marry me instead." The shock that ripped through the church was a physical force, an audible, collective intake of breath that sucked the very oxygen from the air. Marry him? Marry Ryuichi Tanaka? The man who was more myth than mortal, a creature of shadow and violence? Nadia stared at him, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and terror. This had to be a dream, a waking nightmare born from the depths of her humiliation. Yet he stood there, solid and real, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't a proposal born of love or even kindness. It was a declaration, a power play of epic proportions, executed on the stage of her ruin. Why? The word was a raw, broken whisper, torn from her throat. She expected him to mock her, to reveal this as some cruel, elaborate joke. Instead, his expression remained unreadable, his eyes holding hers with an unnerving intensity. "Because I detest waste," he answered simply. "And because I recognize value when I see it." "He sees a liability." Ryuichi's gaze flickered to Julian with dismissive contempt. "I see an asset. A queen requires a throne, and his was made of cardboard. Mine is forged from steel. I offer you a crown and a sword. In exchange, I require your loyalty and your name." It was a contract. A business transaction proposed in the house of God. He wasn't offering her love. He was offering her power. He was offering her revenge. She looked from Ryuichi's impassive, powerful face to Julian's, now slick with sweat, his bravado utterly shattered. She looked to Isabel Vance, whose smug smirk had been replaced by a mask of disbelief and horror. The whispers had returned, but they were different now. Fearful. Awed. They weren't laughing at her anymore. They were terrified for her, and terrified of him. In that moment, something inside Nadia shifted. The raw, bleeding wound of her humiliation began to cauterize, replaced by a cold, burgeoning flame of rage. They had wanted to throw her away, to discard her like trash. This man, this terrifying, dangerous man, was offering her a chance to become the monster they would all fear. With nothing left to lose, she had everything to gain. She lifted her chin, meeting Ryuichi Tanaka's gaze directly. The tears that had threatened to fall now felt like a distant memory. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a finality that stunned even herself. "I will." The rest of the ceremony was a blur, a surreal tableau conducted in a cathedral of stunned silence. The priest, a man who had looked at Nadia with pity just moments before, now fumbled with his scriptures, his hands trembling as he officiated the union between the discarded woman and the city's dark king. Julian and his family were escorted out, not with dignity, but with the quiet, unarguable pressure of Ryuichi's men. Isabel Vance's face was a rictus of fury and disbelief. Nadia didn't sign a marriage license. She signed a contract, a heavy vellum document presented by one of Ryuichi's severe-looking assistants, its clauses written in stark, precise language. She was now Nadia Tanaka. She belonged to him, and in return, his power belonged to her. The drive from the church was as silent as the grave. She sat beside Ryuichi in the back of a black, armored sedan with windows, so tinted the world outside was just a muted smear of color. He didn't speak, didn't look at her. He simply stared ahead, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. The car glided through a set of immense iron gates and up a long, winding drive, coming to a stop before a sprawling estate that looked less like a home and more like a fortress of glass and dark stone. This was her new reality. The house was cavernous and cold, filled with minimalist art and an unnerving sense of order. Servants moved with silent efficiency, their eyes downcast. They bowed to Ryuichi, and then, with a flicker of surprise, they bowed to her. She was the mistress of this place, the queen of this cold, silent castle. Ryuichi led her to a vast living area with a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the entire city, a glittering carpet of lights against the encroaching dusk. "The terms are simple," he said, finally turning to face her. His voice was devoid of emotion. "You will be my wife in every public sense. You will attend functions on my arm. You will run this household. You will present the image of a loyal, untouchable partner. In return, you will have access to my resources, my protection, and my knowledge. Your enemies are now my enemies. Their ruin will be your wedding gift." His words hung in the air, a promise as chilling as it was seductive. This wasn't a marriage, it was an apprenticeship in vengeance. Over the next few weeks, Nadia's life was systematically deconstructed and rebuilt according to Ryuichi's design. Her comfortable, slightly worn wardrobe was incinerated and replaced with a collection of couture gowns, razor-sharp suits, and silks that whispered against her skin. A team of tutors descended upon the estate. One taught her the nuances of high finance, showing her how to read the stock market like a novel and trace the flow of dark money. Another, a severe but brilliant woman, drilled her in etiquette, posture, and elocution until her every movement was imbued with an effortless grace. A third, a former intelligence analyst, taught her how to read people, how to spot a lie in the twitch of an eye, how to wield information like a weapon. Ryuichi himself was her most formidable teacher. He would watch her during her lessons, his presence a silent pressure that demanded perfection. In the evenings, they would dine together in formal silence, after which he would critique her day. "Your posture was weak," he would say, his voice cutting through the quiet. "You hesitated when answering the question about offshore holdings. Hesitation is weakness. Weakness is an invitation to attack." He was relentless, stripping away her insecurities layer by layer, not with kindness, but with brutal, uncompromising honesty. He never complimented her, but she began to see a grudging respect in his eyes when she mastered a difficult concept or offered a particularly insightful observation. He was forging her into a weapon, and she was allowing it, because the memory of Julian's sneer and Isabel's smirk was a fire that burned hotter with each passing day. She learned that her body, the thing she had been taught to be ashamed of, was a source of presence and power. The new clothes didn't hide her curves, they celebrated them, turning her into a figure of opulent, undeniable authority. She learned to take up space, to meet every gaze without flinching, to speak with a voice that commanded attention. The timid, heartbroken girl left at the altar was being buried, and a new woman was rising from her ashes. The first test came a month after the wedding. It was the annual Red and Black Gala, the city's premier charity event, a gathering of the very hyenas who had watched her evisceration with glee. The invitation had arrived on embossed cardstock, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Ryuichi Tanaka. Holding it felt like holding a declaration of war. Nadia stood before the mirror in her dressing room, a vision in a gown of blood-red silk that clung to her figure like a lover's caress. Diamonds glittered at her throat, cold and brilliant. They were Ryuichi's wedding gift. He entered the room without a sound, his own tuxedo a study in black-on-black perfection. He stopped behind her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "They will try to wound you with their words," he said, his voice a low murmur. "They will use pity and condescension as weapons. Do not allow them to. Remember what I have taught you. You are not the woman they remember. You are a Tanaka. You are mine." The possessiveness in his final words sent a shiver down her spine that was equal parts fear and thrill. He adjusted the diamond necklace, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of her nape. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it seared her. When they entered the grand ballroom, a wave of silence followed them. Every head turned. Nadia could feel the hundreds of eyes on her, but this time, the feeling was different. It wasn't humiliation, it was power. She walked with her head held high, her arm linked through Ryuichi's, her steps measured and confident. She saw them immediately. Julian and Isabel, holding court in the center of the room. Isabel's jaw literally dropped. Julian went white as a sheet. They looked at her, then at the formidable man by her side, and the color drained from their faces. Isabel recovered first, her mean girl instincts kicking in. She approached with a syrupy smile. "Nadia, darling," she purred, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What a surprise. I never thought we'd see you again after that unfortunate incident. You look, well, the insult was clear. You're still fat, but at least your new sugar daddy buys you nice things." The old Nadia would have crumbled. The new Nadia smiled, a slow, cool smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Isabel," she replied, her voice smooth as velvet. "And Julian. How lovely to see you both. I must thank you. If it weren't for your spectacular lack of judgment, I never would have received the upgrade. She let her gaze drift over Julian with clinical disdain before returning to Isabel. I've been learning about acquisitions. Sometimes, you have to divest yourself of a failing asset to make room for a truly profitable merger. It's just good business, Isabel's smile faltered. Julian looked like he was going to be sick. Nadia turned away without another word, leaving them standing in a circle of stunned silence. Across the room, she met Ryuichi's eyes. A flicker of something, pride, approval, possession, darkened his gaze before it was gone. The first blow had been struck. The gala was a turning point, not just for Nadia's public image, but for her understanding of the man she had married. She saw how the city's elite, men who commanded boardrooms and held political office, deferred to him. They approached with false smiles and deep-seated fear in their eyes. He navigated their world with a contemptuous ease that she found intoxicating. But later that week, she witnessed the other side of his power. She was in the library, studying financial reports of the Vance Corporation, when she heard raised voices from Ryuichi's office, a rare breach of the estate's perfect calm. Curiosity overriding caution, she crept toward the heavy oak doors, which were slightly ajar. Inside, Ryuichi stood before a man who was bound to a chair. The man was a rival, a man named Petrov who had tried to hijack one of Ryuichi's shipments at the port. Two of Ryuichi's lieutenants stood by, impassive. Ryuichi's voice was lethally soft. "You mistake my silence for inaction," he said to Petrov. "You thought you could steal from me, and there would be no consequences. You thought my recent marriage was a distraction." He picked up a heavy crystal decanter from his desk, weighing it in his hand. "You have failed to understand a fundamental rule. What is mine stays mine. My shipments. My territory. My wife." He didn't shout, he didn't rage. The cold, controlled fury in his voice was far more terrifying. Nadia's heart pounded in her chest. She should have been horrified, repulsed. And a part of her was. But another, larger part was utterly captivated. This was the steel he had spoken of. This was the power that now protected her. He was a monster, but he was her monster. He must have sensed her presence. Without turning, he said, "Nadia, come in." The guard stiffened. Petrov's eyes widened in panic. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her chin held high, feigning a composure she did not feel.
Ryuichi's gaze met hers.
There was no apology in his eyes, only a challenge. "This is my world. Can you accept it?" She walked further into the room, her gaze sweeping over the terrified Petrov with the same cool dismissal she had used on Julian. She stopped beside Ryuichi's desk, placing a hand on the smooth, cool wood. She looked at him, and then at the man in the chair. "He tried to steal from us?" she asked, her voice steady. The "us" hung in the air, a declaration of allegiance. A muscle in Ryuichi's jaw twitched. "He did," she nodded slowly. "Then he should be taught that the House of Tanaka does not tolerate thieves." She turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. She had not only accepted his world, she had claimed her place within it. From that day forward, their partnership solidified into something formidable. Nadia was no longer just a student. She became an active strategist. Her nights were spent not in a shared bed. Their marriage was still unconsummated, a chaste and professional arrangement, but in his office, poring over blueprints, shipping manifests, and rival factions' financial records. She had a keen, analytical mind that had been stifled her whole life, and now, fueled by Ryuichi's resources and her own burning ambition, it flourished. She found a vulnerability in the Vance family's empire, a series of offshore shell corporations used for laundering money, all tied to a seemingly legitimate charitable foundation run by Isabel's mother. It was intricate, arrogant, and, with the right pressure, beautifully fragile. "They're using the annual Children's Benevolence Ball as the primary laundering event," Nadia explained one night, pointing to a flowchart she'd created on a large whiteboard. "Donations are funneled through 3 accounts in the Caymans, then reinvested into Vance Corporation as clean capital. If we leak the initial transfer records to the Federal Banking Commission an hour before the ball, Their accounts will be frozen mid-event. The panic will do the rest. Ryuichi watched her, his expression intense. He wasn't looking at the board. He was looking at her. The way her eyes lit up when she connected the dots, the focused passion that radiated from her. He had intended to forge a weapon, but he had created a partner, an equal. It's a sound strategy, he said, his voice a low rumble. But a federal investigation is messy. It invites scrutiny we do not need. Not if the tip is anonymous, Nadia countered, and not if, at the same time, we trigger a hostile takeover bid for their primary media subsidiary, using one of our own clean holding companies. Their stock will plummet. The board will panic. While they're fighting off the feds and a corporate raid, their social standing will be publicly incinerated. We won't just ruin them. We'll erase them. She looked at him, breathless from her own audacity. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, not to touch her, but to trace the line she had drawn between the Vance Foundation and the offshore accounts. You have learned well, he murmured, his gaze finally meeting hers. The fury you carry, it is a beautiful thing when given direction. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. The lines of their contract had begun to blur into something far more dangerous, far more real. He was no longer just her protector or her mentor. He was the only person who had ever seen the fire inside her and, instead of trying to extinguish it, had handed her gasoline. The night of the Children's Benevolence Ball was electric with tension. It was the Vance family's crowning social achievement of the year, held in the city's most opulent hotel ballroom. This was their turf, their throne room. Tonight, Nadia would burn it to the ground. She chose her gown with the precision of a general choosing his armor, a sheath of shimmering black sequins that hugged her every curve, with a neckline that plunged daringly. It was a dress that screamed defiance and power. When Ryuichi saw her, a rare, almost imperceptible heat entered his eyes. Tonight, he said, his voice a low promise, they will not see the girl they cast aside. They will see the queen who has come to claim her kingdom. As they entered the ballroom, the effect was instantaneous. A year ago, she would have been invisible. Now, on the arm of Ryuichi Tanaka, she was the center of the universe. The plan unfolded with lethal precision. At exactly 9:45 p.m., as Isabel's mother was on stage giving a tearful speech about philanthropy, Nadia's anonymous tip hit the federal servers. 5 minutes later, as champagne was being poured, the hostile takeover bid for Vance Media went live. The first sign of trouble was a frantic buzzing of phones. A senior board member of the Vance Corporation suddenly went pale and rushed from the room. Then another. Isabel's father, a portly man with an air of unearned superiority, was summoned by a panicked aide. A wave of confusion and fear began to ripple through the gilded crowd. This was the moment Nadia had been waiting for. She let go of Ryuichi's arm and moved through the room alone, a shark gliding through darkening waters. She found Isabel near the balcony, her face a mask of confusion and irritation. "Isabel," Nadia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Is something wrong? Your father looks terribly distressed." Isabel glared at her. "What do you want, Nadia?" "I just wanted to offer my condolences," Nadia said sweetly. "I heard a rumor that the Federal Banking Commission has an interest in certain charitable donations. And something about the stock market? It must be so terribly stressful to have one's entire empire built on a house of cards. One little gust of wind, and it all comes tumbling down." The color drained from Isabel's face as the implication hit her with the force of a physical blow. She understood. This was not a coincidence. This was an execution. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You did this," Nadia smiled, a true, triumphant smile. "No, Julian did this. When he decided my worth was measured on a scale. You did this, when you laughed at my pain. You all did this. I'm just collecting the debt." She turned her back on the sputtering, defeated woman and walked back to her husband, who was watching her with an expression of profound, possessive pride. They left the ball as chaos erupted behind them, the triumphant emperors of a fallen city. The silence in the car on the way back to the estate was different this time. It wasn't empty or cold. It was filled with the charged energy of their victory. Back in the penthouse, with the city's lights spread out below them like a conquered territory, Nadia finally felt the adrenaline of the night begin to fade, leaving a strange sort of emptiness in its wake. She had done it. She had her revenge. The people who had humiliated her were ruined, their names turning to ash in the mouths of the very society they worshipped. But the victory felt incomplete. She turned to face Ryuichi, who stood by the vast window, his hands in his pockets. "The contract is fulfilled," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You gave me my revenge." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I did. So what happens now?" she asked, the question hanging between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Was she to remain his trophy wife, a beautiful, powerful accessory? Was it all just business? He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped directly in front of her, his presence overwhelming. "The contract was a lie," he said, his voice a raw, low growl that vibrated through her. "Not the terms. The reason. I did not marry you because I detest waste." He lifted a hand, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her jaw, his touch sending a jolt of lightning through her veins. "I married you because when I saw you standing on that altar, being torn apart by insects, I saw a dragon. They were trying to clip your wings, and I wanted to see you fly. I wanted to watch you burn their world down." His dark eyes bored into hers, filled with an intensity that stripped her bare. "From the moment you said yes, you were never an asset, Nadia. You were mine." The confession was not one of tender affection, but of fierce, absolute possession. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. The last of her defenses crumbled. The emptiness she'd felt was the absence of this, the one thing her revenge could not give her. "And you," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion she could no longer suppress, "are mine." That night, the unconsummated marriage became a true union, a collision of 2 powerful forces who had found their equal in the dark. It was not gentle or soft. It was a desperate, passionate claiming, a sealing of the bond that had been forged in humiliation and tempered in revenge. In the aftermath, lying entangled in the silk sheets of his vast bed, with the city lights painting patterns on their skin, Nadia felt a sense of peace she had never known. The wounds of her past were not gone, but they no longer defined her. They were scars that told the story of her transformation, of the woman she had become. In the morning, she awoke to find Ryuichi watching her, his usual guarded expression softened by sleep and the intimacy of the night. "The Vance and Scott families are finished," he said, his voice a quiet murmur. "Their assets are frozen, their reputations destroyed. Julian is under federal investigation. What do you want to do with the pieces?" The old Nadia would not have known how to answer. But she was not that girl anymore. She sat up, the sheet pooling around her waist, and met his gaze with a newfound clarity. "We buy them," she said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "We buy their media companies, their real estate, their shipping interests. We absorb what is useful and discard the rest. Their legacy will become the foundation of our new enterprise, run by me." Ryuichi's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. It transformed his face, making him look both devastatingly handsome and infinitely more dangerous. "I thought you might say that," he said. And so began their reign. They were a formidable pair, the Dark King and his queen, ruling their empire with a combination of his ruthless efficiency and her brilliant strategy. Nadia Tanaka became a legend in her own right, a woman who had risen from the ashes of public disgrace to become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the city. They were not a fairy tale couple. Their world was one of shadows, danger, and moral ambiguity. But their bond was the most real thing in it, a love story written not in ink, but in fire and steel. Standing on the balcony of their penthouse, looking down at the city that was now theirs to command, Nadia wrapped her arms around her husband from behind, resting her head against his strong back. He covered her hands with his own. They didn't need to speak. In the silent language of their shared power and dark devotion, everything had already been said. She was no longer the chubby girl everyone rejected. She was a queen. And her king had not just given her a crown, he had shown her how to forge one of her own.